Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We recognize that some folks are still signing in, and so we look forward to having everybody on the call. We are grateful for you for joining us for this portion of your Wednesday. I'm Sarah Bouchard from the PKG Center for Public Service. Welcome to the session number 12 of the Journeys Toward Justice series, Climate Change in Boston, Social Determinants, Equity, and Action. Journeys Toward Justice is a multi-school collaboration spotlighting change makers across the country who are advancing justice and equity work forward. The goal of the series is to connect students, partners, and communities with one another and help us all understand the local and historical context of social justice work. As institutions committed to learning, community partnership, and the public good, we feel that it's essential to take time to acknowledge that colonialism and oppression are still very much present in our society today. Many of the social issues that we seek to address disproportionately impact Indigenous people and people of color. Each of our participating institutions acknowledge that the land we now inhabit has been home to many Indigenous communities. MIT acknowledges Indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of the land in the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which we sit is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous people connected to this land on which we gather from time immemorial. It is also not lost on us that much of our country is reckoning with the verdict that was read yesterday in the Derek Chauvin trial regarding the murder of George Floyd. We recognize the value in continuing to raise equity as a focal point in our conversations, and that much work remains to be done in social justice work. We do want to acknowledge that many of our attendees and participants may still be processing the result, and to make a moment of space for that. During today's session, we do encourage you to use the chat function to raise questions to our panelists. Our panelists may not be able to watch the questions as they arise, but our moderators will try to incorporate them as we can. If you do ask a question, we ask that folks do so respectfully. We don't anticipate any problems, but do reserve the right to remove any audience member for inappropriate behavior if needed. To improve accessibility, we have enabled closed captioning for this webinar. Please be aware that the transcription may contain errors. You should be able to toggle this feature on or off by clicking the live captions button and selecting show or hide subtitles. We are also recording this session so that it can be shared with other students beyond this. You should have been provided the option to consent to this recording upon signing in. However, if you did not, please note that we will be recording it, and you may choose to leave if you do not give your consent to be a part of this recording. For most of this session, however, the panelists will be visible, but attendees should not. There are a number of issues impacting the greater Boston community, and many community members and organizations, as well as institutions, are deeply invested in considering the impacts of climate change on the region. We recognize that the topic of equity is critical to conversations on climate change, though not raised as often as we'd like to see. Some people will be disproportionately impacted by the negative impacts of climate change, and today we hope to discuss the nature of equity and climate change, consider who is most vulnerable in Boston, and hear recommendations from people and organizations seeking to make a positive impact. At the end of this session, you will see this slide again. We will have some space for you, and we'll provide the links in the chat to give us feedback as part of an evaluation, to check out some resources that we have, and we will share this as well so you can see our speaker bios, and also to join us at our final event as part of this series. Today, our panelists are Kurt Newton, Director of MIT OpenCourseware and the En-ROADS event facilitator. Hi, Kurt, thanks for joining us. We have Zoe Davis, Climate Resilience Project Coordinator with the City of Boston Environment Department, Susie Jones, Senior Project Manager at the MIT Office of Sustainability, Michael Harvey, MIT Lecturer for Energy and Climate Innovation with the MIT Sloan Sustainability Initiative, and also the Principal Investigator of the Cities and Climate Change Program, Asia Hipsher, MIT Senior studying Chemical Engineering with a minor in French and Francophone Studies at MIT. She is a student fellow with the MIT Office of Sustainability. We have Chiara Wanschaft, an MIT junior, double majoring in economics and mechanical engineering. She is a member of the Environmental Solutions Initiative's Rapid Response Group and a researcher with MIT Sloan's Climate Pathways Project, which houses the En-ROADS tool. And I would also like to thank my fellow PKG Center colleague, Bianca DeLay, who will be assisting and moderating the webinar and reviewing chat questions shared by participants. Bianca supports many PKG initiatives, including those focused on connecting students to community climate change work. As I said, we will share a link in the chat for you to look at our resources. We have our speaker bios there, as well as different resources around climate change and social change action. For today's session, we will start with a simulation activity led by Kurt Newton with En-ROADS and Climate Interactive, and then hear from Zoe Davis about Climate Ready Boston's work in Boston. We'll conclude with a 30-minute panel discussion asking our guests to share how they are engaged in climate change work, how we can better incorporate a lens of equity into our efforts, and to share strategies to get involved ourselves. Kurt, we'll start with you and our En-ROADS simulation.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everyone. I'm so glad that you're here. Give me a moment here while I adjust the screen sharing. Okay. Yeah, so we're going to talk about climate change, but we're not going to start by talking about climate change. Climate change, so often when it's discussed out in the world, is a matter of science and numbers and big global things and things way out in the future. I want us to go through an experience, though, that helps us understand how immediate some of these climate change issues are and how deeply they intersect with the most fundamental social justice issues that are out there. I think many of you have been on this, great experience over the last month or so on some of these social justice events. And I'd like to start by just checking in with you about what you think our most pressing social justice issues are. If we can use poll EV, I've dropped this into the chat. If you can make your way over to there, and I'd love to just hear what are your most pressing social justice issues? Jump over to the poll here. Economic opportunity for all, food security, racism, housing, voting rights, public schools, education, ecological crisis, public health. There is a lot to get done. These are all, certainly resonating with me. Thank you. So many of the things that are on this list, are really actually quite powerful climate solutions, as well as important things to address from a social justice standpoint. Jump back. Right? This is usually what climate change conversations are about. Look at those emissions curves. Oh my God, we might be on a path for 4 degrees warming if we're not careful. Maybe if we work really hard, we can get it to 2 degrees, or 2.5 degrees, or maybe 3 degrees centigrade. Okay, that's great. Meanwhile, I got to worry about putting food on my table and the fact that I might be getting kicked out of my apartment. And, I just had this heinous experience out on the street. Yeah, come back to me about this. Well, actually, the things that we need to do to improve our lives, everyone's lives, and center equity from a justice perspective are going to be solving a lot of these climate change issues as well. Typically, when we're looking at climate change policies, we're given a choice of, a bunch of things on the menu. And we'll go through this actually in the climate modeling exercise in a bit. But, we talk about the energy system transition, getting away from fossil fuels to renewables. We talk about carbon pricing, and that might or might not be, a regressive tax or a progressive tax. It might really hurt people with low incomes. We need to do all kinds of things with transport efficiency and building efficiency and electrification. Land use policies. Who's got access to the land? What are they able to do with it? What do we do about, the huge impact on our ecosystems that animal agriculture has, the impact on economic growth, population growth happening in uneven ways around the world, and how that influences climate change. Lastly, there's new technology coming down the pipe at some point. Might be carbon capture, it might be nuclear fusion. When a policymaker who's thinking about climate change, is doing their work, historically, this is the stuff that they've focused on, right? What do we do? How do we move one of these levers and boost this and cut a little of this down? Well, it's really, really important, though, to center in these conversations. And this is for all of us as citizens and how we work with our policymakers and, in our communities at home, that many of these policies have really important co-benefits. And if we can understand those co-benefits in what we at Climate Interactive have termed the multi-solving lens, that solutions that are rooted in justice, that produce really powerful co-benefits in health and resilience and well-being, also are really great climate solutions, we're going to be much, much further ahead. Classic example, we can burn less coal. We can shut down coal plants because it has a huge impact on our greenhouse gas emissions. But in the most immediate term, it's going to improve the air quality and help reduce asthma today for the communities that are living right next to those coal plants, and improve the lives of people who are dealing with that coal infrastructure. So, two birds with one stone, or I don't like that analogy. Two birds, held together, right? We deal with the coal problem. We're both short-term, really improving our health, and long-term protecting climate. So if we can ask ourselves when we're talking with each other about what our issues are through this multi-solving lens, how does solving my problem, the solution to this thing I'm really concerned about, also help you solve yours? These issues also, involve so many different people, many of whom have been excluded from these conversations, especially around climate policy decisions. Who else needs to be in here weighing in, especially on some of these short-term, multi-solving co-benefits issues? This is a really important question. Lastly, and definitely not least, what overall is going to strengthen our connections? Because it's the strength of those connections that's going to get us where we need to go, making progress on all of these policies. I hope this sounds good to people. Hope this makes sense. It's unfortunately not the way that climate change has been talked about historically, but over the last few years, it's starting to build in this direction, and I could not be happier. So yes, underneath all of it is a whole lot of science, climate physics. You can't argue with climate physics, but at the foreground, it's the impact in people's lives. And to the extent that we can center these issues and foreground these when we're having conversations, making choices, I think we'll have a healthier society overall, and we'll deal with climate change. So let us build the future on climate justice solutions. Let's jump over now to the model, the Inroads model. And I would like to ask you, sorry, confused among my screen shares here. I'd like to ask you, what's your top priority climate action? What's on your mind as a climate solution that might be both a really great climate solution and also foregrounds justice, foregrounds equity? Still got that pull EV window up? Sorry, coal in the ground was mine when I was testing this earlier. I forgot to clear it. Sustainable food systems, renewable energy, clean drinking water for all, vegan diet, education opportunities, free public transit, air quality for BIPOC communities in particular, carbon tax. Good. So there's a lot of stuff to work with here. So let's jump over to the Inroads model here, and let's put a few of these things in and explore how these issues intersect. Okay, you seeing the Inroads model? Yeah, good, good. Okay, so Inroads is a little graphy. There's no doubt about it. But these are really important graphs. On the left, I'm showing, the mix of global sources of energy that are really driving so much of our world from the year 2000 to the year 2100. And on the right, a graph of global greenhouse emissions. In a business as usual scenario, we are currently, given where we are right now, heading for a future that's 3.6 degrees centigrade or 6.5 degrees Fahrenheit, higher than pre-industrial at the end of the century. That is absolutely devastating, right? So I heard solutions to take this on that include, for instance, let's improve our transportation system, right? Let's clean up our transportation system. Let's get the diesel buses out of there and the diesel trains out of there and try to electrify that stuff. What happens if we start right there in the absence of any other solution? So let's crank up the electrification. What did you notice? I can go back and play that again. We cranked up electrification of our transportation system. Over here on the right, on the left, the amount of oil in the latter part of the century, that's that red line, whoops, come down a little bit. Greenhouse gas emissions came down a little bit. What else might we need to do? I think there was something about affordable housing, equitable housing, and cleaning some of that up as well. Burning oil in our furnaces is not helping. What happens if we just electrify our buildings? Greenhouse gas emissions come down a little bit. We've got another, 1/10 of a degree out of it. We look back at the global sources of energy. Coal, there's still quite a lot of coal happening here, right? If we jump over to, there's a great graph here of PM 2.5 pollution. It's coming from all of that coal and still a lot of that oil. And that has not come down very much. So let's add another thing into the solution. What do we think? I saw renewable energy on the list. Let's boost some renewable energy. Crank that up. All right. So what you're seeing in this model, the Inroads model, is what's known as system dynamics. And what it does is it says that when you make one change out in a complicated system, other things are adapting to it. So watch what happens when we throw in a whole bunch of renewable energy there. Some things in the energy mix go down. Coal comes down a little bit, oil comes down a little bit, even the blue natural gas comes down a little bit. And because coal is such a bad one in the atmosphere, we're starting to make a real dent in our air pollution, the PM 2.5. So air quality is going up. That's really, really good. One other thing that people talk about is just making sure that coal stays in the ground. And there's different ways to do that. You can institute a policy that just says, we are no longer going to allow new coal to be built. We can also put a really strong carbon price for every ton of emitted carbon. You got to pay a lot of money, and that just makes coal even less and less affordable. The market-driven mindset that drives, the United States and a lot of places around the world likes carbon prices more than those sort of prescriptive policies. So you crank up a carbon price. What do you think is going to happen? Well, that pushes every fossil fuel source down, and especially coal. That's getting closer and closer to a less destructive level in the atmosphere. This is getting good. This is getting good. I saw vegan eat less animals, eat more plants. So the En-ROADS model gives you the ability to drill into these different policy levers in a little more detail. And when it comes to methane emissions, which are the bad greenhouse gas that, in particular animal agriculture is causing, we can deal with that one separately from leaking methane from our natural gas pipelines, for instance. So if we got the world to just eat way more plants, let's cut those agriculture and waste emissions. We're dealing with food waste better by, say, 3/4. What effect does that have? Drops the temperature, global temperature, down by another 1/10 of a degree. That's helping. Growing some more trees, that's helping. Less deforestation. In especially regions of the world where people are pushed to like clear more land to grow say soy and corn to feed the cows that we're eating. Less deforestation if we can get ourselves off of eating so much meat here in the country. It's getting even a little better. We're getting real close to that 2 degrees centigrade area. Let me just ask you if you want, what's your one final best push on these climate policies that could help us with foregrounding justice and equity that we haven't put in here? Drop your ideas in the chat. We just got a couple minutes here. Let's see if we can not only take it over, down from 2.3 degrees C rise by the end of the century to 2 degrees C. Any ideas? Energy efficiency of transportation and buildings. Okay, that's a good one. Crank that up. Aha. There's a lot of inefficient buildings out there. Here in the state of Massachusetts, buildings and transportation are responsible for a huge amount of our ongoing emissions. Massachusetts got an early jump on getting coal out of our electricity grid, but we have a lot of work to do here in Massachusetts to make our buildings more efficient and to clean up our transportation system. And that is a perfect note to wrap up on. Let's crank this all the way to the top and see if we can get it to 2. No, not quite. A little more carbon price. How about a little technology? There, 2 degrees C. Okay. Thank you, Cassandra, for that suggestion, because it's specifically retrofitting our buildings, cleaning up building heating and cooling, and cleaning up our transportation emissions that are really top of mind here in the state of Massachusetts and in the city of Boston for what we need to do. When we retrofit houses, if we're not careful, we're going to clean up some emissions. But if it's not done centering equity, we're also at a risk of dramatically increasing gentrification, kicking people out of their houses, making the people who are lower and middle income, who need to live in the city so that they can get to work in the city, they get pushed out of the city. Their commutes grow longer and longer. They're looking at, hours of transport back and forth to their job, and hopefully they've got really good childcare because they're going to be working long hours, So we want to make sure that when we clean up their, the building energy efficiency, people can afford to live here still, and that our transportation system works for everybody as we green it up. Electrical vehicle subsidies are awesome, but they are not a substitute for making a car-free transportation system for people who rely on public transport and other means getting in there as well. So if we can keep those things top of mind, we can not only get to 2 degrees centigrade, but do so in a way that builds greater justice and equity around the world, and in particular here in the city of Boston. So thank you for your engagement, your great ideas. We deserve a round of applause. We did it. And I'll just say that this tool from Climate Interactive En-ROADS is free online. It's available for anybody to use. There's fantastic resources to learn how to use it, facilitate these events. Sometimes we work in this kind of like focused workshop mode. There's also a simulation game that's really a blast. It takes about 2 to 3 hours where you get to role play different sectors of society and use the model to come to agreements. There's a question here from Peter. Sarah, is it okay if I just take 1 minute to answer this?
Definitely, please.
Great. Okay. Peter says, we've talked a lot about primary sources of energy. Should we consider the consumption side? Metrics that track carbon discharge by consumers, spread across income levels. Yes, that is absolutely part of what we should be thinking about. The En-ROADS model and the system dynamics model that's running with have some sort of simplifications and limitations that are put on it so that it kind of runs instantaneously on a web browser. Absolutely, people who are doing more sophisticated climate modeling are looking at this stuff all the time, and sometimes on a very kind of granular, region-specific or stratified by different kind of socioeconomic classes. That stuff is possible. En-ROADS, it's a little beyond the scope. I mean, there is an economic growth slider in here, for instance. And if we were to say, you know what, this extractive economy that's been driving us over the climate cliff, if we could just ramp that back a little bit, maybe a 1% per year, growth might be enough, especially if, the care side of the economy is built up and bolstered it, and we're taking care of people. There are some things in the model here that you can play with that will allow you to get a sense. Their impact directly on kind of global emissions and thus global climate outcomes is a little softer than some of these like direct emissions things that we've been talking about, but they're definitely in there. And when it comes to thinking about equitable policies to roll this stuff out, I highly encourage Peter. Yes, keep thinking and talking about that. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. This tool I think it's a great primer to start thinking about the different policy levers that we have, at our disposal to try to affect change. I think, and thank you for sharing that it is a public and usable source. We've put a link for it in our resource folder so folks can check it out. But you definitely have us thinking sort of about how every decision has consequences and impacts, and how does that impact the next set of decisions. And so we're excited to turn our conversation to Zoe Davis with Climate Ready Boston to really help focus this topic on a specific place, on Boston. And so we're hoping to consider, as we look at climate change, how is Boston expected to be impacted? Who are the people in our community that will be most vulnerable? And then what are some great organizations working to address these anticipated impacts? So Zoe, thank you for being here, and we're excited to hear from you.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here with you all tonight. Can you all see my screen okay? Perfect. All right. Well, again, thank you so much, Sarah and the MIT team for the invitation to come and speak with you all. Just to frame this conversation, I'll start off with a bit of a framework for what Climate Ready Boston is and what we've been working on over the past couple of years. And then I'll spend some time sharing about climate hazards and the vulnerabilities that Boston faces, and also get into some of the resilience initiatives that are taking place across the city, not just within the city, but also some community-based organizations. And anything I don't get into, I'm happy to dig into when we hit our discussion. So hello again, I'm Zoe Davis. I'm a climate resilience project manager for the City of Boston Environment Department, and specifically I work in climate and resilience adaptation planning with the Climate Ready Boston team. I'm sure that many of you have heard of Climate Ready and are familiar with the program, but for those who are not, it's the city's initiative to develop resilient adaptation solutions to prepare for the longer term impacts of climate change. So Climate Ready was a significant next step for the city in climate preparedness, building off of the broader climate action plan And essentially, what we aim to do is to integrate resilience across policy, planning, development, and implementation, so that Boston will be protected and thrive within the context of a changing climate that we're anticipating. And so to do this, climate adaptation planning encompasses a few things, including the development of solutions for infrastructure and the built environment, but also, as Kurt was talking about, developing solutions to prepare our people and our communities so that folks will be able to withstand and recover from climate hazards. So the way that we do this is by taking a layered and holistic approach to resilience and adaptation. And this means folding in resilience into planning for buildings, neighborhoods, and districts. So thinking at multiple scales, and then also folding in resilience into ordinances, zoning, education, and other interventions. But this also includes resilience in our regional assets, our infrastructure and institutions that are within the city, but have critical regional implications. So this is a graphic from the 2016 Climate Ready report, and it outlines the need to study a wide range of approaches to secure Boston's climate future. So here we have some of the major climate hazards that Boston faces. But the process that Climate Ready has undertaken to reduce future climate hazards is to first identify the hazards, and then to develop an understanding of the risks that these hazards pose. So the projections of future climate risk, the projected future climate hazards are, as you see here, extreme temperatures, precipitation, sea level rise, and coastal storms. The projections for Climate Ready were actually developed through a group called the Boston Research Advisory Group, called the BRAG. And then there was a subsequent vulnerability assessment that was conducted to understand the extent of all of these risks. And so for our area, primarily these are extreme heat, stormwater flooding, coastal and riverine flooding. And what this allowed was a spatial understanding of where we would see the greatest risk, what communities would face the greatest burden of these risks. So I'll come back to each individual risk in a moment. But from there, what we do is to focus on vulnerable areas in neighborhood specific planning for further study based on the urgent timing and the extent of the risk. We also take this approach because each neighborhood is unique from the natural geographic composition as well as the development features to the communities and the cultures that give these neighborhoods their character. And so ultimately what this allows us to do in the process is to focus on place-based solutions to be developed alongside communities so that we can be attentive and really look at specific needs and interests. So after the publication of the 2016 Climate Ready Boston report, we've been pretty busy undertaking the more detailed district level analyses, specifically for coastal resilience, to essentially develop our climate to-do list of infrastructure and programs to protect the city. And ultimately this list is growing. So as you can see from the timeline here, we started off with East Boston and Charlestown because there was the highest risk for the projected near-term flood pathways there. And then that was followed by South Boston in 2018. And then in 2019, we completed the vision for Moakley Park. And essentially that was to close off the flood pathways in that area while also improving open space amenities and waterfront access and protecting critical neighborhood assets like public housing. And just last year, we recently completed both the North End downtown and the Dorchester reports, I think around October of last year. And since we have launched phase 2 of East Boston and Charlestown to come back to the areas that were not studied in the previous analysis, as well as launched a citywide planning process for heat resilience. So I'll touch on those really briefly. This is sort of what's next. This is what's going on currently. As I mentioned, we have the heat resilience study that is ongoing, and I'll get into that a bit more. And then in East Boston specifically, resilient design options being led by the Boston Planning and Development Agency. Again, additional planning, or I should say planning in other areas of East Boston and Charlestown that weren't covered in the first planning process. And then the Coastal Resilience Overlay District, which is also being taken on by the BPDA. And I'll add here that our colleagues at the BPDA, we work very closely with on these resilience efforts here. And so as these plans are implemented, essentially they'll help us to achieve the vision that was presented in 2018 for a resilient Boston Harbor, achieving a continuous system of coastal protection for Boston's 47-mile shoreline, as well as protection from urban heat risk, especially for the inland communities. So as we begin to scratch off these projects and items from our climate to-do list, essentially, we'll not only better protect the city from sea level rise and coastal flooding and extreme heat, but also we hope to increase access and connectivity and improve our open spaces as well. So moving into what these climate risks look like as a coastal city, as I'm sure you all well know and have experienced, coastal flooding is a very clear and present risk. So what you're looking at right here is a rendering of the Boston Harbor under future flood conditions. So this might be a bit of a funky way of looking at the harbor, but just to orient you, on your left is the direction of the South Shore, where Dorchester is. On your right is the direction of the North Shore, and you can see East Boston there. So just to further orient you, moving from right to left, moving from left to right, you have Dorchester, South Boston, and East Boston. But what this image shows is the projected flooding that we'll see around the next 50 years, so 2070, looking at about 40 inches of sea level rise under a 1% annual chance storm. So essentially the odds here of experiencing a flood of this magnitude is about 1 in 100 each year. But just looking at the areas that are that will experience significant flooding, we can see over in the Dorchester area by the Neponset River, just significant flooding across the Dorchester shoreline, and moving right where Moakley Park is, and then into South Boston, where we see some incredible amounts of flooding, as well as in the North End downtown. You can see flooding over in Charlestown by the Little Mystic, and then also flooding in East Boston. So literally there is flooding across the, is projected to be across the entire shoreline. And so So far, I mean, as we've seen, Climate Ready has completed initial studies in all of these neighborhoods. And with the completion of the second round in East Boston, we'll have completed plans for the full 47 miles. So moving into stormwater flooding, what you're looking at here is a map of the projected stormwater flooding from 2030 to 2070 due to an increase in precipitation from more frequent storms and more frequent precipitation. So the orange represents flooding to 2050. And then the purple that you're looking at represents flooding to 2070. It may be a little tricky to see, but you might be able to notice that many of the areas where there is projected flooding, those areas follow major transportation corridors, like along Morrissey Boulevard. You can really plainly also see Moakley Park there. And they also follow the interstates, I-90, Route 93. And I'm sure many of you know and have experienced stormwater flooding that is already occurring today. And this is due to the fact that the city's drainage system can sometimes be overwhelmed by the current storms that we're having. But we work really closely with the Boston Water and Sewer Commission to integrate resilience planning into their systems for monitoring and infrastructure so that we can ultimately plan how best stormwater infrastructure that they're putting in, as well as the heat and coastal resilience infrastructure can maximize co-benefits for one another. They recently undertook and completed the development of a rather stunning model to predict the movement of water water on the surface of the city. So essentially what their model takes into consideration is a number of different storm types as well as sea level rise scenarios. So if you like playing with models and maps, I am more than happy to send that link your way. But you can also search for it online. It's Boston Water and Sewer's inundation model. And now moving on to heat, what you're looking at here is a map of the daytime land surface temperature. This data was also developed for the 2016 report, but what you can see here is a significant amount of South Boston, again, as well as East Boston, portions of Dorchester, Roxbury, and Charlestown are in these relatively high heat zones. And these areas that are hotter are urban heat islands where there's significantly less vegetation and higher concentrations of paved concrete or asphalt roads or dark built surfaces that retain heat. So while extreme heat in the city affects everyone, there are people who are disproportionately affected. This is something that we know very well. And vulnerabilities to extreme heat can be impacted by a number of things like access to cooling resources, your age or your health conditions, potentially your profession. So people who may be more susceptible to heat risk are older adults, especially folks who are living alone, young ones, infants, babies, and young children, folks who are no income to low income residents, outdoor workers, and then those who have pre-existing chronic conditions. So this is essentially the distribution of what heat looks like right now. But the city is planning for future heat stress. So one of the ways that we're taking on extreme heat in the city is through the heat resilience study. And this is an initiative that we've recently launched to identify a suite of heat reduction and heat resilient strategies that will work for Boston's context. Understanding that there's a broad range of community experiences to heat and unique cultures, land use and building typologies, all of this factors into a range of possible solutions. So the study is focused on specific neighborhoods that we intend to, and we also intend to further hone in on more site-specific spaces. So we're focusing engagement and solution development in neighborhoods where heat islands overlap with environmental justice communities, understanding that the disproportionate effects of heat in these communities have been caused by a history of inequitable and purposeful development practices. And the most well-known of these is redlining. But these communities include Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, East Boston, and Chinatown. And so through this process, what our goal is to co-create solutions with the folks who live, work, and play in these neighborhoods. And you might be asking, how are you focusing on specific neighborhoods, but this is called a citywide plan. Our goal here is to identify ways for the solutions that we identify in these specific neighborhoods to be applicable in other areas of the city. But we are also looking at the city at a sort of higher landscape level, taking into consideration what some of the trends are across the city as well. So there are some relatively well-known solutions and interventions within the heat space. So the questions that we would like to answer through the study here are, what are some of the barriers to implementation if we know some of the interventions that we can put in place? How will we monitor interventions to ensure that they're working? And what are the benchmarks and goals that we should be setting? And then what is the landscape of existing community knowledge on heat risk and resilience? What are the perceptions around heat, and why do communities hold these perceptions? So all of this will go towards developing solutions that are fueled by community interests and community needs. But another question that we're asking alongside these is, how do we quantify the consequences of heat risk, and as well as the benefits of mitigation measures? And so a step in this direction, specifically for the urban canopy, the urban tree canopy, was taken through a full tree canopy assessment that the Boston Parks and Recreation Department led. So while there's a number of cooling and heat reduction tools, our urban canopy is one of the city's most critical natural resources and assets in extreme heat mitigation. So what you're looking at here is a map that shows the city's current tree canopy. This is from the assessment, which was it was for a 5-year period, so from 2014 to 2019. But this is an image of the current tree canopy right now, divided into 25-acre hexagons across the city. Ultimately, the goal of the project was to understand the trends in tree canopy gains and loss. And what they found was that the number of trees and the percentage of tree canopy ultimately remained relatively the same. So just to orient you in this map here, the areas where there's lighter beige hexagons, these are areas where there is less tree canopy, and then the darker areas are where there is more tree canopy. So there are some landmarks that stick out. Here, you might be able to make out Jamaica Pond and Franklin Park, as well as Stony Brook Reservation, and this is on the more southwest side of the city, in the Roxbury, Dorchester, JP area, Hyde Park. And then very noticeably, there are other areas of the city that are lacking trees, such as the North End downtown areas, South Boston, East Boston, particularly where the airport is. So where I'm going with this is just to show you that trends in tree canopy can also map to where we see trends in urban heat. So the image on the left that you're seeing is the average air temperature measured in Fahrenheit across the city. This was a map that was developed through the Wicked Hot Boston project that was led by the Museum of Science. But again, it's broken down into 25-acre hexagons. And the areas that you're seeing that are in dark red are hotter. The areas that you're seeing in yellow are lighter. And so right away, we can see where the North End, where downtown and South Boston are, as well as where the airport is, are hot. And switching over to where we see the tree canopy, there's significantly less trees. So this is essentially just to make the case in the step of, or I guess, making a step in the right direction to understanding, how we can sort of spatially understand our mitigation assets. But the study also did a statistic analysis on greening and heat. And found that there was actually a significant negative relationship between tree canopy and air temperature. So essentially what this indicated was that areas where there's higher tree canopy help to reduce the urban heat island effect. So again, a step in the direction of understanding how we might actually quantify these heat mitigation measures using nature-based solutions. So when we think about the success of climate resilient solutions, whatever form they take, and what it means within the context of social resilience, to work towards and achieve an integrated and citywide resilience system, what it means is we have to aim to do this through a resilience and equity lens. And so Climate Ready builds on a number of initiatives, including Resilient Boston, which was the city's first strategy to advance racial equity. So Resilient Boston has designed an approach to understanding how policies, programs maximize resilience investments, how they might act as conduits for or reduce inequities. Or how they can take action to address challenges, specifically related to social resilience as well. So this is something that Climate Ready is working on building. This is something that we're working on really integrating into our processes so that we can clearly see them in our outcomes. But to build a spatial understanding of who climate hazards impact, Climate Ready conducted a social vulnerability assessment as a part of the 2016 original process to basically get that spatial understanding. So for this process, we mapped out 6 socially vulnerable populations, but we do know that there are many other ways in which one can be vulnerable, and that many of these impacts and identities are compounding. But we started to mapping out 6. And what this essentially did was help us to identify who it was that was impacted where in the city, especially mapping that against where we're seeing the climate hazards was significant in understanding where we start and how we connect with communities. But this has essentially been a reference that continues to be a part of our team's planning efforts today. And so thinking about the impacts of climate risks and who stands to benefit from climate solutions, really at the core of this work is the people of our city. It's really critical to recognize that systems of inequality are compounded by the effects of climate change. So a critical part of building climate resilience in Boston is to ensure that the solutions that are being developed and the resulting benefits are accessible to all of our residents, especially those who are disproportionately impacted. So we really see climate adaptation as an opportunity to work towards building social resilience as well as climate resilience in our work with our communities and within our communities, as well as supporting the work of other organizations who are engaged in these efforts. So just to share a few examples with you today, there are so many in Boston, but Boston's communities are leading some really amazing work in the climate space, in the social equity space, in energy and sustainability. There are a number of community-based organizations, neighborhood associations, nonprofit organizations that are leading this work. And so we really see ourselves as our role as one who needs to lift up these efforts and support these efforts. So I'll just talk about these couple of organizations here. The first I'll start with is Codman Square Neighborhood Development Corporation. They're a really robust community-based organization. They're in the South Dorchester Codman Square area, of course. And they focus on developing safe and sustainable housing for low and moderate income residents. And they also help to develop commercial spaces as well. They work in a wide range of spaces, including economic development, community engagement, and energy. One example within the space of green infrastructure and workforce development, they have a certification class in green infrastructure. I actually took that class. It was a really great experience to learn about the technical side of green infrastructure implementation, as well as the maintenance, and to really get some hands-on experience. So if you're looking for that opportunity, definitely reach out to Codman Square, and I can connect you directly with the folks who manage that process as well. They've also been doing, as I said, some really great work within the energy and climate space. Last year, they partnered with a nonprofit climate energy organization to provide education, as well as, or I should say, education on low cost energy solutions, as well as to provide energy assessments for folks. And they also completed 14 energy retrofits. So some really amazing work by them. And then the last organization I'd like to touch on really briefly is the Garrison Trotter Neighborhood Association. They're located in the Roxbury area. It's sort of on the northeastern side of Franklin Park. But they focus on community empowerment within Roxbury. They've done some work in the affordable housing and ownership advocacy space, environmental stewardship, specifically with the city. They led the development of a fan and air conditioning cooling program for last year to provide an indoor cooling option for folks who, specifically older adults and folks who had chronic health issues during this, the hot summer during lockdown. So we partnered with them as well as local public health organizations, faith-based organizations, and a few other community-based organizations. But they were leading some, and they continue to lead this work. The idea is to launch the second year of that program. So really excited to continue to partner with them on that. But again, there are so many organizations who have been doing some great work in this space, but I'm glad I could just share a few examples with you here. So with that, I'll conclude and just say thank you so much again. And I look forward to discussing more.
Zoe, thank you so much. I think to be able to show in such a short amount of time the method of applying research to community collaboration to co-create solutions for vulnerable communities, you've covered a lot of ground, and I really appreciate the maps, especially to sort of really illustrate for us where our neighbors and our community members going to be impacted the most. So awesome overview. There's a great question in the chat from folks working, around the country in different cities facing maybe similar challenges, similar impacts of climate change, and wondering about possible resistance we've seen in Boston from folks from more affluent communities resisting investment going to lower income neighborhoods. So I think it's a great question, and we'll move now. We'll give you a break for a couple of minutes. We'll get into our panel discussion, but when we come back to you, I wanted to share that in case you'd like to touch on that point as well. So we do have, for our last half hour or so, we have great folks from MIT connected to different efforts across the country, the state, and the institution, trying to engage in climate change. And we've invited these folks to really illustrate that there's many ways we can engage in equity conversations and efforts, and many ways depending on where we are in our own lives. And so I'm excited to highlight some of these efforts and folks that we have on the call. So Susie, I'd love to start with you. If you can share your role at MIT and a bit about how you engage in climate focused work, as well as what methods of social change that you are primarily engaged in. And also, if you have thoughts about how institutions can better work towards equity around climate change, I think we would all love to hear that. So I'll hand it to you.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and thanks so much, Zoe. I feel as a City of Boston resident, it's always wonderful to learn and hear more. So awesome work. So yeah, I work in MIT's Office of Sustainability. So for folks, on the webinar tonight, if you are at a college or university with an Office of Sustainability, feel free to give them a shout out in the chat. Love to see people from all over the country who are, working with their offices of sustainability. We're a tight network. So our office, our responsibility is really to make the campus itself as sustainable as possible. So we work with students, staff, faculty, but we also really engage with the cities of Cambridge and Boston. So this is sort of where MIT lives. So we're sort of residents of the cities too. So my teammates and I in the office, we all have sort of our unique roles, sort of these portfolio niches. I work on transportation, food, education, open space, gardening, all of which I think deeply connect to climate and certainly to equity work. So for instance, the food system, which is sort of one of the areas maybe I'm most passionate about, as Asia knows, who works closely with me. So the food system is responsible, Kurt kind of mentioned this, I saw some, chats come in around, vegan diets. So food is responsible for, a quarter of the greenhouse gases that humans generate each year. But we know that food is sort of like more than just a math equation, right? It's about culture, it's about identity, it's about livelihood, it's about safety. So it's really important to put equity and people at the center of that work too. So at MIT and Cambridge and Boston, that's meant not only, calculating the greenhouse gas impact of our food at MIT and advocating for more plant-based options, but it's also meant for me getting to know the local fishermen, getting to know about sustainable fisheries in the Northeast, understanding food security in our student populations, increasing procurement amongst diverse businesses, and more. So that kind of gives you, I think, a little bit of an example of how, we approach this certainly from an environmental and climate standpoint, but really putting, equity and people at the center of that. So sort of like social change wise, I think, at the Office of Sustainability, we try to do a lot of community building, a lot of participatory planning. I've heard that echoed a lot, sort of like this attempt to co-design, co-create. For me, I've really been inspired. We're so lucky at MIT to have just incredible scholars. So I've been really into people that are looking at the intersection of design and equity. And so we have a great professor named Cesar McDowell in our urban studies department who kind of has these design principles that a lot of us, I think, doing work around urban planning or community planning or environmental work kind of look to for guidance. And he has one called kind of design for the margins. And the idea is that you can build stronger and more equitable systems by designing with and for the margins. So by designing for the margins, you're really actually designing for everyone. You're solving for everyone. And folks at the margins are actually better positioned to innovate because they have a broader sense of the system from which they've been excluded. So it's so important to design for collaboration, design for equity, design for the margins, and bring people in who are really the most innovative and best positioned to be solving these issues. So I found a lot of inspiration for that. And I think in terms of higher ed, especially in fields like the traditional environmental field, which I think has been white dominant or sort of entrenched in some racist thinking, to really look at the leaders who have always been talking about racial equity and social justice, but who maybe have been marginalized, and to center that work, to read about it, to learn about it, to amplify it, to jump in, and to use sort of those frameworks just every day in your attempt to make systems sort of better, more equitable, more sustainable. So yeah, I think that's probably covers it.
Susie, thank you so much. I know in our own conversations, we've talked about sort of like aspiration toward equity and recognizing that big institutions often, want to claim what they're good at first. And so equity is a space where I think we all have to grow. And so I appreciate the strategies that you're sharing, because I think though we know what we need to do or what we're looking for, it's aspirational. And so we have to take steps to get there. And so I appreciate you sort of laying out actual concrete things we can do. And for folks on the call who are from cities all over the country, we hope you also, like Susie said, look at offices of sustainability at your own institutions and think about these strategies. So thank you, Susie. That's great. Harvey, I'd love to turn it to you. You are a man with many different roles, so I'd love you to highlight how you're connected to MIT. And then I know you've been involved in a lot of different legislation or policy efforts, and I'm wondering if you can share how you've helped support several of those, or one if you'd like to highlight, as well as what strategies, tactics, or considerations you think are necessary to sustain work addressing climate change.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So I hope you guys can hear me okay. And so I answered the questions that you asked me with what's behind my head and my background, but it's probably a little bit hard to see. So I wonder if I can share the screen and show it as a screen share. Is that all right?
Definitely.
Yeah, how's that? Is that, can you see that?
It looks great.
Yeah, so basically what I do at MIT, this is something I started later in my career. I was an MIT student in the early to mid 1970s, but I've come back having a career involved with energy efficiency and what's called energy management. I work with business and technology and policy students. And basically what I think I do is I'm not so much a scientist as using the science and trying to work with the students to come up with creating innovative ways to manage energy. So this has been a solution at different times in my career to, at one point, crushing fuel shortages, certainly poverty caused by a huge run up in energy prices, but most recently it's been about climate change, and it's a really important part of it. So I find this really fulfilling, and I think for the students I work with, I've seen them go on and have careers, and there are so many jobs. There's 3.5 million jobs in the clean energy and energy efficiency sector, more than the entire remainder of the energy sector in the efficiency and clean energy sector. And also their personal activism. And that really goes to the second part of your question. So we're working on energy management, just to put a little bit of what that is. It's much more energy efficiency. I had an energy efficiency company, energy efficiency engineering and software company for most of my career. It's about smart buildings and working with the electric grid, because the grid is composed of solar and wind energy now, which is great. But these are intermittent resources. So we have to have our buildings work with them. And our buildings themselves can be solar paneled with battery. They must become mostly electric, because that's what we need to do. We need to work towards a time in the not distant future when we no longer use natural gas. So that really changes the landscape. And there's certainly such big equity issues associated with it. So on the policy question, we're really working, not only we know now towards 85% less energy for neutrality, but 50% by 2030 is really important. 50% by 2030 was essentially what we needed to build into the last major law, which was signed on March 26th in Massachusetts. It was one of the first laws anywhere that put this goal of being 50% below our historical standard of carbon emissions by 2030, which is coming right up. And this was a challenge. So really what happened with me is that I was involved in the very first Earth Day 51 years ago tomorrow. It's something that got me into my career. 20 million people showed up, which was a country that was half as many people as now. So it was a huge number of people. And this resulted in a lot of laws, including the Clean Air Act. And Massachusetts 10 years ago got the EPA to recognize under the Clean Air Act that carbon dioxide is a pollutant. It's something we needed to actually now start to solve as well. And some laws were passed then. But what happened since the laws passed 10 years ago is we realized beginning 2018 how important 50% was. A study that came out of the IPCC, activism again by Greta Thunberg and a lot of young people, that's brought the state together and a lot of activists in the state together to come up with a new bill. And this wouldn't have happened, particularly with everything else going on right now in the last year's election and all the really important other issues that people had, unless there was so much activism. So now we have this new law. And because of it, we're going to have, it was the issue, how can we get people to reduce the carbon? Essentially, we have carbon taxes in effect on power plants and on transportation. We have state level appliance standards. We have an environmental justice framework so that everything we do considers what the impact will be on justice communities. New incentives, new efficiency programs and building codes. These things make a big difference and working towards the end of the gas. So bottom line on this is when we're active, when we do things, we move forward. And when we stop being active, and this has happened a number of times over the last 51 years, we stop. So the real message is, these are young people that I've been involved with, that are doing exciting businesses, that have been involved in government. And my challenge to everybody here is to keep active and keep moving forward.
Thank you so much, Harvey. And you are a person who really shows the many different modes of social change and what you've been part of, whether it's advocacy, policy, research, business. There's so many ways to engage. And you wrote this amazing reflection on being part of that first Earth Day, as well as pointed to great folks like Greta Thunberg. And so in our resource folder, we do have some inspirational things there, including that reflection from Harvey. So thank you for sharing that with us. I'd love to also now, turn it to Asia. If you can share a bit about your role at MIT, we'd love to know who you are and how you're engaged. And then also, can you share a bit about how you've tried to build sustainability into your academic life?
Absolutely. So hello, everyone. My name is Asia Hipshire. I'm a senior studying chemical engineering, and I recently started working this semester in the MIT Office of Sustainability with Susie as the Campus Environmental Justice Fellow. So as a student, I've engaged with sustainability-focused work, mostly through research projects and through my coursework as well. Those research projects have included, for example, engineering more energy efficient solutions for gas separations or water filtration, reducing material waste, for example. And then more recently, in my position At the Office of Sustainability, my work has mostly been in engaging the campus, the MIT community, in environmental justice issues on and around campus, whether that's through holding workshops, creating resources for community members to make more informed decisions, or building partnerships across the campus with the Office of Sustainability. So as for building sustainability into my academic life, I would say there's no lack of research happening at the Institute that's working towards climate solutions, and that's where my interests lie as well. So I've been able to pretty easily find projects to work on for reducing energy waste or material waste that I'm interested in the Department of Chemical Engineering. And on the coursework side of things, I don't have an explicitly environmental focus as a concentration or a sustainability minor or anything like that. But sustainability does find its way into my coursework, and I've been able to select projects that align with my interests. So one example this past semester was I took a project class. So we were working on one project for the length of the course. And in my case, we were tasked with modeling the production of carbon neutral jet fuel. So that's an example of how sustainability or climate solutions have found its way into my coursework. What I would like to see, however, in the future is more of a focus on equity when it comes to coursework and research projects as it relates to climate solutions. And this is true for all engineers, but thinking about chemical engineers specifically, students like me who study chemical engineering may go on to be the ones who make decisions about where to locate a power plant or a factory, which will no doubt generate emissions and pollutions and could pose serious environmental issues depending on where these factories and power plants are located. So I would like to see more of this aspect of ethics built into the curriculum. All engineers have to engage with ethics as a student, but I think this is something that's lacking from what I've seen. And then on the research side of things, I have also not really seen the level of ethical consideration of projects that I think is important to have. I would love to see a shift in priorities coming from the top, from department heads, principal investigators, to consider the potential implications of whatever may come out of said research. And for students who are thinking about these potential impacts, to be empowered to build that into their work without having to worry about falling behind in terms of publications or awards or whatever it may be for their career trajectory. And for students, again, I think this would also mitigate this burden falling on mostly students of color, the ones who are maybe thinking about these issues most intimately. I think it would be better for these priorities to come from the top and for it to matter to everyone in the department. Granted, I've only engaged with research as an undergraduate, and maybe there's more of this at the grad level that I don't see. But given that MIT really prides itself on its undergraduate research program, I think it is important to engage undergrads in this work, even if it's not their own personal project, like as a grad for their degree.
Asia, thank you so much for that. I so appreciate your point of view and, talking to you about how you built this focus into your own academics. I mean, that takes a lot of self-initiative to build it in what you're passionate about. And so you're an awesome example for other students who are passionate about social change and want to put it into their own research. But I also love this piece of calling sort of the powers that be accountable. And you give a lot of food for thought for staff and faculty of how do we better build ethics around social change and equity into the work that we do. As part of this series, there's a lot of faculty and staff involved in the calls. And so you're giving really good food for thought for all of us across the country of how can we do that better. And I think, as we talk about equity work, we know there's a long way to go. And so those are great points, a good roadmap. Thank you very much. So,
thank you.
Kurt, I want to also pass it to you a bit. You've really covered a lot of ground with En-ROADS, but I know you're involved in a lot of change personally as well. So if you would like to share a bit about your roles, but also, what methods of social change are you primarily engaged in personally, advocacy, legislation, activism, and what strategies have you found to be effective?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I would say that my involvement in climate change is very closely connected to working at MIT and being part of this community. Through the early 2000s, I was paying attention to this issue, but it was like a dim, distant future thing. The United Nations and the grown-ups in the room, they'll take care of this, right? It was becoming clear that wasn't the case. And the fact that that I could engage with people who I was in touch with, who I had contact with to work on these issues was really fundamental to me getting out of my chair and getting involved. And that local involvement with people, who you can be in touch with, continues to be sort of the center of the work that I do around climate and climate justice at this point. My professional job directing MIT OpenCourseware, is a huge contribution, we think, to equitable education around the world. The access that we've created, and the last few years, I've been very conscious about trying to use that platform to couple it into the most pressing issues of the day and make sure we're doing everything that we possibly can to engage people and share knowledge around that stuff. And MIT is an amazing place to get to do that. Not only the course materials from the classroom that we're sharing, but also all these other resources. As I got more into climate change, and I'd say especially post 2016 presidential election, I got even more engaged out in the world, and the opportunity to work at my state level and at the city level, and even like right here in my neighborhood. All these things are really complementary. And I think, being able to operate at those different levels and experiment with what it's like to try, this type of community, this type of scale. There's so much that needs to be done. You don't have to do it all. Believe me, I've tried. It doesn't work. But find the place that's like your footprint and get something happening. It might be something that's going on in your town or through some other network that you're deeply connected with. But I think it's not an exaggeration to say that climate justice is everybody's job. Yes, it's fantastic if people can make it central to their work, but there's stuff that everybody needs to contribute to. So whether that's pushing our elected officials to keep equity front and center when they're making climate policy, working with your city, working with your school, there's just so much that can be done. I know we're running short on time, so I'll just cap it there.
Well said, Kurt, and thank you for giving some also real concrete strategies. I'm loving that community is emerging in everyone's comments. Obviously, we have to do this together, so I really appreciate that. Kiara, I'd love to also give you a chance to share more student perspective. I know you've been involved in a lot of cool different efforts on campus as well. And so I'd love for you to share a bit about who you are and how you've been involved, and also what strategies have you found to be effective in engaging on campus and also in the community. And are there, specific modes of social change that you have found effective as a student?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Kiara, and I'm a junior studying economics and mechanical engineering. And I think a lot of what I focused on this year is sort of on MIT's climate action. And so engaging with the student body through the Undergraduate Association, which is MIT's student government. So we've had a lot of conversations with students and really realized how much they care about climate, and have I've been focusing on lofting those ideas and recommendations on the climate action plan to administration. And so I think a few things have really, from those conversations, we've realized a few things, and a lot of them relate to equity, as in there are a lot of instances in which a lot more students could be involved in these conversations and could be exposed to climate. And I think that sort of became evident. The Undergraduate Association Sustainability Committee did a survey where only 25% of people said that they have taken a climate related course at MIT. And I think every course is basically climate related at this point, or should be in some way, shape, or form, given how cross-cutting sustainability is. But clearly that is not making its way to students. Students aren't feeling that way. And so one way to just get a lot more of a diverse perspective, a lot more voices involved in climate conversation, is by infusing climate into all of our classes and making that really salient to the students who are taking those classes. So that's one thing. I think another thing that became really evident is that also in terms of opportunities after MIT, so in terms of jobs and internships, or even internships during your time at MIT, a lot of students sort of feel like there's this trade-off where either you're working on something that is for the social good, or you're working on something where you might make a lot of money or enough money, and it sort of feels like financial stability is at odds often with social impact. So I think really making sure that we are having opportunities at these at career fairs that are like really made and shown to be high flying opportunities, or so for instance like something like the UN or something like that, but also you could have big companies that these students could go off to work at that are going to be, offering a high financial return, but making sure that MIT is advocating for students to be intentional and judicious with what they decide to do in those companies. So, having open and honest conversations about, okay, let's, if we're going to end up as leaders in these really cool companies because they offer, like high financial opportunities. So we're making sure that we're opening up those opportunities to lots and lots of students, making sure that students are thinking about, what is the impact that they're going to make as leaders? What can they do at Google that's related to climate, things like that. So yeah, I think that opportunities through classes and then with jobs, making sure that, making sure that my headphones are dying. Everyone could have an opportunity to do that, I think could get a much more diverse voice involved.
Kara, thank you so much for that. I think there's a lot that you say that echoes what Asia was saying around sort of institutional support of these values we stand for. And so whether it's infusing ethics into education or valuing, employment opportunities, having companies really value this work, there's a lot of work to be done, but these are great strategies and avenues to target. So I really appreciate you highlighting that and also sharing the student perspective, because it's easy to feel, like you said, Kurt, sort of, oh, maybe there's people over there who are working on this. And the truth is it's sort of up to each of all of us to be engaged. And as a student, when you have a million other things competing, to be engaged, it is a great model of pathways for others. So we really appreciate the student voices on this panel. Zoe, we will pass the last questions to you as we are winding down. You've shared so much about the work that you do with Climate Ready Boston. I'm really curious to hear, what gives you hope in the work that you do, especially against such daunting challenges. And if you have advice for folks about how we can get engaged in climate change work where we live, whether locally in Boston or beyond, are there organizations, types of organizations you think we should seek out? And then we also had that great question in the chat around affluent communities and resistance. So if there's anything of that you would like to address, I think that would be a great way to close.
Sure. So just to answer the first question, where I see hope, just in the fact that we're having these really action-oriented equity dialogues as a team, as a department, a city, as a region. I think municipalities are realizing that the resilience that we want to achieve is really tied to how we understand and holistically integrate community needs and interests. It's so tied to recognizing historic wrongs, and I think we're realizing that it's so tied to diversity being an asset for collaboration and innovation. So just as Susie was saying, designing for the margins and really making space for opportunities for, innovation and collaboration. It's huge because the climate space, there's so much that can be done. And it's a relatively new space where a lot is going on. To your second question, which was around climate action and how can folks get involved, A really good place to start is to understand what your communities are doing, what community-based organizations are doing. And I mean, I think one of the good ways to do that is to find community hub spaces. Organizations like your local neighborhood associations, your faith-based organizations, your local watershed. Those are organizations that are looking for volunteers. They're looking for people to engage and who are excited in other work, but also climate work. And just a quick plug here for the city. Understand what your city is doing. Email your municipal leaders. We read your emails. We love setting up conversations with you. Ask for information about what's going on. Ask to set up an informational interview. I think those are some good ways to get involved. Really quickly to your last question, Sarah. This was a question around what, funding and financing?
When we encounter resistance, especially for reallocating resources to underserved communities, do we see that in Boston, and are there strategies you would recommend? It's a big question, so
yeah,
we'll take any nugget of wisdom.
Yeah, I mean, there are areas where we see that, but then there are also areas where people are really willing and excited to contribute. I think going into these projects, that's the biggest question. How are we going to fund this? I mean, we're at like $3 billion worth of infrastructure programs, and the list only keeps growing. So, we come into this knowing that, and letting people know this is complicated. There's really no easy conversation around this. But then the second is that it's really on all of us. While the city is continuing to identify these priority projects and to secure funding, the scale of the funding is honestly, it's significant. And so at the same time, all of these projects cross public and private, city, state, and federal lines. So essentially it's a matter of, I think, building consensus, especially with our our private partners. So building consensus to develop private-public partnerships is, I think, one of the best ways to move forward in that conversation.
Thank you for tackling that question. It's a big one, and it really speaks to organizing and connections, which I think is something all folks on this call have tapped into. I do want to thank everybody for joining us today, especially our panelists, for sharing your insights, your experiences, and suggestions as we collectively consider ways that we can engage across the country and also in our own neighborhoods. And whether, at other universities, are there efforts that students on this call can join. So thank you all for that. The PKG Center is very happy to be part of the Journey Toward Justice series. And we would like to invite all folks who would like to participate in Friday's last session. It's a closing reflection session. It's going to be sort of focused on, what do we do next and how do we stay connected? So if you're inspired by these equity conversations, we would invite you to join. In the chat, I'm just putting a few links. We've got a link for an evaluation for this session, as well as where to RSVP for Friday. And then also just, again, a link to our folder so that you can check out resources. Over the next couple of days, we'll probably keep adding to it because there's so many great things that have been surfaced, and I want folks to be able to access those. But thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to hear everyone's perspectives, and we're excited to see what action steps might come from this moving forward. Thank you all.